The cold October air sent a shiver through my skin as I adjusted my vampire mask. It was Halloween night, and for the first time, my parents had given me permission to go out with my friends unsupervised. Excitement bubbled in my stomach, mixing with the nervousness of newfound freedom. The streets of our neighborhood were full of costumed kids, their laughter echoing in the darkness as they dashed from house to house. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered on every porch, creating a festive and slightly spooky atmosphere. I met my friends at the corner of Maple Street as planned. Jake was dressed as a zombie, with green makeup and torn clothes. Sarah had gone for a witch costume, her pointed hat bouncing with each step. And Mike was wearing a t-shirt with the word costume written on it in permanent marker. Classic Mike. Our candy bags were empty, but our expectations were huge. This night promised to be epic. "You won't believe this," Jake said, practically bouncing with excitement. "My parents said we could stay out until 10. That's a full 2 hours." Our eyes widened at the news. Normally, we had to be home by 8, when most of the houses had already turned off their porch lights. 2 extra hours meant we could explore the neighboring streets, where rumors said they handed out full-size chocolate bars. Sarah pulled a crumpled map from the pocket of her cape. "I marked all the houses that gave the best candy last year," she explained, pointing to several red circles scattered across the paper. "If we follow this route, we can maximize our candy haul." We all nodded enthusiastically. Sarah was always the planner, and her strategy seemed flawless. With a collective war cry of trick or treat, we set off on our adventure. The first few houses were a total success. Our bags started to get heavy with an impressive variety of treats. Chocolate bars, lollipops, gum, and even a few small toys quickly piled up. The excitement of the night, combined with the sugar we'd already consumed, left us in a euphoric state. Little did we know that our fun was about to take a strange and unsettling turn. As we walked down Oak Street, one of the darker streets in the neighborhood, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. About 20 meters behind us, there was a man pushing a stroller. It wouldn't have been strange on any other night, but on Halloween, with the streets full of costumed kids and no other adults in sight, the lone figure felt out of place. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling growing in my stomach, focusing on the candy and the fun with my friends. Sarah was the next to notice. "Hey, did you guys see that man with the stroller?" she whispered, glancing discreetly over her shoulder. Jake and Mike turned to look, and I saw their expressions shift from curiosity to discomfort. The man seemed to be following us, always keeping the same distance. Every time we stopped at a house, he stopped too, pretending to adjust something in the stroller. The carefree atmosphere of our night began to dissolve, replaced by a growing sense of tension. We decided to pick up the pace, hoping to leave the strange man behind. We skipped a few houses on our planned route, focused on getting away from that unsettling presence. But no matter how fast we walked or how many turns we took, the man with the stroller always seemed to be there, a persistent shadow in our Halloween night. The weight of the candy in our bags, once a source of joy, now felt like it was dragging us down, slowing our escape. When we reached the end of Maple Street, the inevitable happened. The man, who had kept his distance until now, suddenly sped up, quickly closing the gap between us. My heart raced in my chest as I heard his raspy voice call out behind us, "Hey kids, wait up!" We exchanged panicked looks, our legs frozen in place, unable to run. Slowly, we turned to face him, and for the first time, I could see his face clearly under the streetlight. He was older than I expected, with deep wrinkles around his eyes and a scruffy gray beard. He wore a worn-out coat and a hat that partially obscured his face. His eyes, though, shone with an intensity that made my throat go dry. "Looks like you've been doing great tonight," he said, his gaze drifting to our bags full of candy. "How about some more? I've got a box full at home. Special treats I save for special kids like you." His smile, meant to be friendly, only heightened my unease. Something was seriously wrong, and I knew we had to make a crucial decision. The silence that followed his offer was deafening. I looked to my friend for guidance. Jake seemed ready to accept, his eyes lighting up at the thought of more candy. Sarah, always the voice of reason, bit her lip, torn between the desire for more sweets and the warning bells ringing in her head. Mike, on the other hand, was already taking small steps backward, like he was preparing to bolt at any moment. It was Jake who finally broke the silence. "What kind of special treats?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and hesitation. The man's grin widened, his yellow teeth glinting under the weak light. "All kinds? Imported chocolates, rare candies, things you've never even heard of," he answered, his voice as smooth as melted caramel. Despite the alarm going off in my head, I felt a flicker of interest. Sarah, ever practical, asked the question we'd all been avoiding. "Where exactly is your house?" The man pointed down a side street, dimly lit and deserted. "Just over there, 2 blocks away. It won't take long," he assured us, already moving to guide the stroller in that direction. We exchanged nervous glances. The idea of following a stranger down a dark street went against everything we'd been taught. But Halloween was about adventure and excitement, right? And we were a group, after all. What could really go wrong? With a hesitant nod from Jake, who seemed to have taken charge in that moment, we began to follow the man. Every step toward the dark street echoed in my ears, a muffled warning I was determined to ignore. The stroller creaked softly in front of us, a sound that seemed out of place somehow. As we moved away from the well-lit, busy streets, the reality of the situation began to weigh on us. The distant hum of other kids trick-or-treating faded, replaced by the sound of our own footsteps and the constant creaking of the stroller. The man kept a steady pace ahead of us, occasionally glancing back with that unsettling smile. Part of me wanted to turn around and run, but curiosity and the promise of those special treats kept me moving forward. After what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few minutes, we arrived at an old house set back from the street. The peeling paint and dark windows gave the place an abandoned look, nothing like the festively decorated homes we'd visited earlier. The man stopped at the gate, turning to us with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Here we are," he announced, his voice unnervingly cheerful in the quiet night. With a creaky groan, he opened the rusty gate and invited us in. I hesitated on the sidewalk, a chill running down my spine. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin through the costume. "Maybe we should go back," she whispered, but her voice was drowned out by Jake's enthusiastic exclamation as he followed the man up the leaf-strewn path to the front door. The inside of the house was even more disturbing than the outside. A dim yellow light illuminated a narrow hallway, revealing faded wallpaper and furniture covered in dust. The smell of mold and something else, something I couldn't quite place, filled my nose. The man pushed the stroller into a dark corner and turned to us, rubbing his hands together. "Wait here," he said, his voice now lower and raspier. "I'll get those special treats." As the man disappeared into a nearby room, we huddled near the door, exchanging nervous glances. The silence inside the house was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of an old clock somewhere nearby. Mike, who had barely spoken since we entered, suddenly whispered urgently, "Guys, this is all wrong. We need to get out of here." But before we could respond, something caught my attention. The stroller in the corner started to move slightly, as if its occupant was stirring. Driven by a curiosity stronger than my fear, I stepped toward it. Sarah tried to pull me back, but I was already too close. With my heart pounding in my chest, I reached out and slowly lifted the cover of the stroller. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't a baby. It was a doll. An old, creepy doll with glassy eyes that seemed to stare right back at me. The scream that escaped my throat echoed through the entire house. I jumped back, stumbling over my own feet and landing on the dusty floor. My friends, alarmed by my scream and the sight of the terrifying doll, panicked. Jake was the first to react, rushing to the door and struggling with the handle. "It's locked," he shouted, his voice trembling with fear. Sarah and Mike joined him, pulling and pushing the door with all their strength. The sound of heavy footsteps coming from the other room made us freeze for a moment. The man was coming back and fast. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice boomed, now devoid of any of the fake kindness he'd shown before. That was the last straw. With a surge of strength born from pure terror, Jake finally managed to wrench the door open with a loud crack. We didn't waste another second. We bolted out of the house, stumbling over each other in our haste to escape. We ran down the dark street, our feet pounding against the pavement. We could hear the man's angry shouts behind us, but none of us dared to look back. Our candy bags, forgotten inside the house, didn't matter anymore. All we wanted was to get as far away as possible from that terrible place. We turned one corner, then another, not really knowing where we were going. Fear pushed us forward, despite the burning in our lungs and the aching in our legs. It wasn't until we reached a busier, well-lit street full of other trick-or-treaters that we finally slowed down. Panting and trembling, we looked at each other, tears glistening in everyone's eyes. No one spoke for several minutes, all of us trying to process what had just happened. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence. "We need to tell someone," she said, her voice still shaky. "That man is dangerous." We nodded silently, too shaken to speak. That was when I noticed a woman watching us from her porch. She had a concerned look on her face and approached us slowly. "Are you all right, kids?" she asked gently. "You look scared." Something about her voice, her motherly tone, broke down the last walls of our resistance. The words came spilling out, all of us talking at once, recounting our terrifying experience. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Thompson, listened with growing alarm. Her face paled when we mentioned the man with the stroller. "I know that man," she said, her voice low and urgent. "He's lived alone in that old house for years. He's never had children." That bit of information made my stomach churn. The image of the doll in the stroller flashed through my mind, even more disturbing now. Mrs. Thompson didn't waste any time. She ushered us into her house, gave us hot chocolate to calm our nerves, and immediately began making calls. First to our parents, then to the police. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Patrol cars arrived, lights flashing and sirens cutting through the night. Officers asked questions, took down our descriptions, and quickly headed toward the man's house. Our parents arrived soon after, a mixture of relief and fury on their faces. I was pulled into a tight hug by my mom, who silently cried on my shoulder. My dad, his face tense with worry, spoke in low tones with the other parents and Mrs. Thompson. I overheard fragments of their conversation. Words like trauma, therapy, and legal action floated in the air, deepening the sense that nothing would ever be the same after that Halloween night. In the days and weeks that followed, the story spread throughout the town. We found out that the man had been arrested, but the details of what the police found in his house were kept quiet. Rumors circulated at school, each version more terrifying than the last. But for the four of us, the truth was scary enough. Our nights were haunted by nightmares, and during the day, we were followed by looks of pity and morbid curiosity. Worst of all was the impact on our friendship. Our parents, fearful and overprotective after the incident, started keeping us apart. Maybe they thought that being together would remind us too much of that terrible night. Or maybe they were afraid we might encourage each other to take more risks in the future. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Slowly, painfully, our friendship began to unravel. The carefree jokes and shared laughter seemed like a part of a different life, one we'd left behind on that fateful Halloween night. Months dragged on after that Halloween, each day bringing new challenges. Therapy sessions became a regular part of my routine, as they did for my friends. At first, it was hard to talk about what happened. The words felt stuck in my throat, the memories still too vivid and painful. But gradually, with Dr. Michael's patient guidance, I started to process the trauma. I learned techniques for dealing with the nightmares that still haunted me and strategies to face the moments of anxiety that caught me off guard. At school, things were complicated. The stares and whispers followed me through the halls, as if I carried an invisible mark of what had happened. Some classmates avoided me, as if our bad luck was contagious. Others, driven by morbid curiosity, tried to pry sensational details out of me. Jake, Sarah, Mike, and I became involuntarily united by this shared experience, forming a small, isolated group separate from the rest of our peers. At home, my parents did their best to help me move past the trauma, but I could see the fear in their eyes every time I left the house. The rules became stricter, my movements more monitored. I understood their concern, but at the same time, it felt like I had lost a part of my freedom of my childhood. Halloween, once my favorite holiday, now brought only a knot in my stomach and memories I wished I could forget. As time passed, I noticed subtle changes in my friends. Jake, once the most outgoing of us, became more withdrawn, his smiles rarer. Sarah threw herself into her studies with an almost obsessive intensity, as if seeking control in a world that had shown itself to be so unpredictable. Mike, on the other hand, developed a keen interest in martial arts and self-defense, determined never to feel vulnerable again. Despite our individual ways of coping with the trauma, there was a silent understanding between us. We were the only ones who really knew what had happened that night, the only ones who could fully grasp the weight we carried. That mutual understanding kept us together, even when circumstances threatened to pull us apart. Autumn came again, bringing with it the golden leaves and cool air that used to fill me with anticipation for Halloween. Now, every jack-o'-lantern and costume in store windows made my chest tighten. There was only a week left until the anniversary of that fateful night, and the tension was palpable, not just in me, but in the entire town. The incident had left a deep mark on our community, changing the way everyone saw the once-beloved holiday. At school, the teachers and administration were visibly on edge. Posters about Halloween safety lined the hallways, and lectures about the dangers of talking to strangers became frequent. I noticed that many parents now walked their kids to the school doors, a habit that had become more common since our encounter with the man and his stroller. The innocence that had once surrounded this time of year seemed to have been irreparably stained. Jake, Sarah, Mike, and I gathered in the school courtyard during recess, just as we had so many times throughout the year. The topic we had all been avoiding finally came up. "What are you guys doing for Halloween?" Sarah asked, her voice low and hesitant. A heavy silence fell over us. The idea of going out trick-or-treating seemed absurd, almost sacrilegious after what we'd been through. But at the same time, there was a latent desire not to let fear control us forever. It was Mike who finally broke the silence. What if we did something different this year? Something just for us, away from all the craziness. His suggestion was met with hesitant nods. The idea of facing Halloween together, on our own terms, had a certain appeal. We started planning a small gathering at Sarah's house, whose parents had been the most understanding throughout the year. It would be a night of movies, games, and maybe a chance to finally confront our fears in a safe environment. As Halloween approached, I felt a confusing mix of emotions. There was fear, of course, but also a growing sense of determination. I realized that despite everything we'd been through, we were still the same friends who had once set out excitedly for a night of trick-or-treating. The man with the stroller had taken a lot from us, but he couldn't take everything. With that realization, I began to feel something I hadn't expected. Hope. Maybe, together, we could start to rebuild what had been lost and find a new way to celebrate. Not just Halloween, but our friendship and resilience. I was only 6 years old when I decided, for the first time, to venture out on Halloween night with my older brother Tom. Up until then, the dark and eerie world of that holiday kept me locked inside, hiding under the covers, imagining monsters lurking in the shadows. But that year, something changed. Maybe it was the sweet smell of caramel in the air, or the gleam in Tom's eyes when he talked about bags full of candy. Suddenly, my fear of imaginary creatures seemed small compared to the promise of endless sweets. My mom helped me into a pirate costume, complete with a plastic eye patch and a hat that was way too big for my head. She smiled, but I could see the worry in her eyes as she handed me a paper bag decorated with smiling pumpkins. "Stay close to your brother," she said, adjusting my hat for the 10th time. "And don't talk to strangers, okay?" I nodded solemnly, barely containing my excitement. The streets were filled with kids in costumes, their laughter echoing in the crisp October night. Tom led me from house to house, teaching me the sacred ritual of trick or treat. With every door that opened, my bag grew heavier and my heart lighter. The fear that once consumed me gave way to sugary euphoria. I was living an adventure, conquering my fears one piece of candy at a time. As we walked, Tom told me stories of past Halloweens, about houses that gave out giant chocolate bars and others that handed out fruit, to everyone's disappointment. I hung on his every word, imagining myself in the coming years as a seasoned trick-or-treater like him, knowing all the secrets and tricks to maximize candy collecting. The night felt magical, illuminated by carved pumpkins and distant stars. As we ventured further into the neighborhood, my candy bag grew heavier and heavier. The weight was comforting, a tangible proof of my courage. Every new treat was a small victory over my childhood fears. I couldn't wait to get home and examine my treasure, imagining the trades I'd make with Tom and the sweets I'd save for the gray winter days ahead. In that moment, I felt invincible, a true pirate on a quest for the greatest treasure of all, a childhood filled with sweet memories and nighttime adventures. The night wore on, and our journey took us to a street I had never seen before. The houses here seemed older, with creaky wooden porches and yards full of gnarled trees. Tom said this was the rare candy street, where quirky neighbors gave out treats you couldn't find anywhere else. My eyes sparkled at the thought of adding unique treasures to my already heavy bag. We stopped in front of a particularly dark house. The peeling paint and dark windows made me hesitate, but Tom encouraged me with a gentle push. "Go on," he said. "Show them you're brave." I swallowed hard and climbed the creaky steps. Before I could knock, the door slowly opened. A tall man, wearing a long dark coat and a hat that shaded his face, stood in the doorway. "Trick or treat," I mumbled, my voice barely audible. The man said nothing, just extended a pale hand over my open bag. For a moment, I thought I saw something white drop in, but it was too dark to be sure. "Thank you," I said, automatically, quickly stepping back. The man just nodded before silently closing the door. Tom was waiting for me on the sidewalk, eager to know what I had gotten. "I don't know," I confessed. "It was too dark to see." He shrugged, suggesting we could check it out later at home. We continued on, visiting a few more houses before deciding it was time to head back. My bag was so heavy by then that Tom had to help me carry it the rest of the way. All the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious man and what he had dropped into my bag. There was something about the way he moved, the atmosphere of that house, that made me uneasy. But I was too young to fully understand that feeling, and the excitement of examining my haul of candy soon pushed those dark thoughts aside. Little did I know that the small item hidden among the chocolates and lollipops was about to turn a fun night into something far more sinister. We arrived home breathless and smiling, eager to show Mom our spoils. She greeted us at the door with a warm smile, but I saw the tension leave her shoulders when she saw we were safe and sound. "Come on, let's see what you got," she said, guiding us to the kitchen. Tom and I dumped the contents of our bags onto the table, a colorful cascade of shiny wrappers and tempting treats. Mom started sorting through the candy, making small comments about the more unusual finds. I watched eagerly, waiting to see what the mysterious man had given me. That's when I saw something white emerge from the pile of chocolate bars and lollipops. Mom picked it up, turning it over in her hands curiously. It was a small cloth doll, all white, with black embroidered eyes and an enigmatic smile. For a moment, I was fascinated by its simplicity and oddness. But then I looked at my mom's face and felt my heart freeze. She had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. The doll slipped from her trembling fingers, landing silently on the table. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. I told her about the dark house and the strange man, watching her face grow even paler with every word. Tom, sensing something was wrong, came closer, looking confusedly from the doll to our mother. "Mom, what is it?" he asked, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Mom sat down heavily in a chair, her eyes never leaving the little white doll. "Kids," she said slowly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something that happened when I was young. Something I hoped I would never have to remember." She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage, and began to tell a story that would forever change how I saw Halloween. "When I was about your age," Mom began, her voice low and shaky, "something terrible happened in our town. It was Halloween, and all the kids were excited to go out and ask for candy, just like you today." Her eyes seemed distant, lost in long-buried memories. Tom and I sat, mesmerized by the change in her voice, the palpable fear that radiated from her. The day after Halloween, the rumors started. Some kids had received white dolls in their candy bags, just like this one. She pointed to the doll on the table, not touching it. At first, no one thought much of it. They were just strange dolls, after all. But then, she paused, swallowing hard. Then the kids started disappearing. A chill ran down my spine. Tom shifted uncomfortably beside me. Mom continued, her voice now barely a whisper. One by one, the children who had received the dolls vanished. Without a trace, without explanation. The police investigated, of course, but they never found anything. It was as if they had just evaporated. The town went into panic. Parents started obsessively searching their children's Halloween candy, throwing out anything suspicious. The next Halloween was practically canceled. No one dared let their kids go out. Mom closed her eyes for a moment, as if the memories were too painful to bear. But the worst, she continued, opening her eyes to look at us intensely, was what happened to my best friend, Sarah. She received one of those dolls, and a week later, her voice faltered, and I saw tears well up in her eyes. A week later, she disappeared. The last time anyone saw her, she was talking to a strange man near the school. A tall man, wearing a long dark coat and a hat. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. I looked at the white doll on the table, feeling as though it was watching me with its button eyes. Suddenly, all the fears I had conquered that night came rushing back, now amplified by a very real and very close threat. The silence in the kitchen was thick, broken only by the constant ticking of the clock on the wall. Mom stood up abruptly, her hands shaking as she reached for the phone. "I need to call the police," she muttered, more to herself than to us. Tom and I exchanged worried looks, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in. As Mom dialed frantically, I couldn't take my eyes off the white doll. Its stitched smile, which had seemed innocent before, now mocked me with a sinister air. Every detail of the night came flooding back. The creak of the porch steps, the deep shadow hiding the man's face, the brief glimpse of something white falling into my bag. My stomach churned with the realization of how close I might have come to danger. Tom, ever the protective older brother, put an arm around me. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Mom was speaking rapidly into the phone, her voice alternating between urgency and fear. Words like white doll, disappearances, and predator floated in the air, each one deepening the sense of dread settling in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, Mom hung up the phone. Her face was pale, but there was a fierce determination in her eyes. "The police are on their way," she said, sitting back down at the table. They said they'll investigate. But they also said it could just be a coincidence, or maybe someone trying to scare people based on the old story. I looked back at the doll, feeling a confusing mix of fear and fascination. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I expected. Mom sighed, running a hand through her hair in a gesture of exhaustion and worry. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about the man from the dark house. Was he really the same monster from my mom's stories? Or was it just a creepy coincidence? The shadows in my room seemed to move and dance, and every creak of the house made me jump. Halloween, which had just hours earlier been an exciting adventure, had now turned into a nightmare I feared would never end. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity and anxiety. Police officers came and went from our house, asking endless questions and examining the white doll from every possible angle. I repeated my story over and over, describing the strange man and the dark house with as much detail as I could remember. Tom sat by my side during the interviews, occasionally adding his own observations from that night. Mom was constantly on the phone, talking to other parents in the neighborhood, warning them about the possible threat. Fear spread quickly through the community, with rumors and theories popping up by the hour. Some people said it was just a bad prank, while others swore they had seen a suspicious man lurking around the streets in the nights following Halloween. The police combed the neighborhood, focusing especially on the street where I had gotten the doll. But the house I had described seemed to have vanished. No house in the area matched my description exactly, and none of the residents fit the profile of the strange man. It was as if the house had disappeared into the Halloween night mist, taking all the answers with it. As the days turned into weeks, the intensity of the investigation began to fade. There were no reports of other disappearances or of any more white dolls being found. The police started to suggest that it might have been an isolated incident, maybe someone trying to recreate the old urban legend to scare kids. But for me and my family, the uncertainty lingered, a constant shadow hanging over our lives. Slowly, life began to return to normal. The Halloween decorations were put away, replaced by Thanksgiving and then Christmas ornaments. But something had changed irreversibly. My childhood innocence, so recently celebrated on that trick-or-treat night, now felt distant and unreachable. Every time I passed a window and looked out onto the street, part of me still searched for the man in the hat and coat, waiting for him to emerge from the shadows to reveal the truth behind the mystery that had become part of my life. Months went by, and life went on, but the incident with the white doll left deep scars on our family. Mom became more protective, always double-checking that the doors were locked at night, and insisting that Tom and I keep her informed of our whereabouts at all times. Nights spent playing in the backyard after dark became a distant memory, replaced by board games in the brightly lit living room. At school, I became known as the kid with the doll. Some classmates avoided me, as if the mystery were contagious, while others bombarded me with questions, fascinated by the story. I oscillated between wanting to forget everything and feeling a strange need to understand what had really happened. Tom, ever the protector, did his best to shield me from the whispers and curious glances. As the next Halloween approached, tension in our town grew once again. Community meetings were held to discuss safety measures, and many parents decided not to let their kids go trick-or-treating. The town hall organized a party inside a local gym as an alternative. But for me, the magic of the night had been completely lost. I stayed home that year, helping Mom hand out candy to the few brave kids who still ventured out. As the years passed, the white doll incident gradually became a whispered story, a local urban legend. Younger kids told it around campfires and at sleepovers, often distorting the details or adding fantastical elements. For most people, it was just another scary Halloween story. But for me, for Tom, and for Mom, it was a constant reminder of how thin and terrifying the line between fantasy and reality can be. Sometimes, late at night, I found myself thinking about the mysterious man. Did he really exist? Or was he just a product of my childhood imagination, fueled by Mom's scary stories? The white doll, stored somewhere in the police archives, remained the only tangible proof that something had really happened that night. But even that proof was shrouded in mystery and doubt. Years passed, and I grew up, leaving behind the scared child who once trembled at the sight of a simple cloth doll. Now, as an adult, I look back and try to understand the impact that Halloween had on my life. The story of the white doll became part of who I am, a piece of the puzzle that makes up my identity. In quiet moments, I still find myself reflecting on that night. The shadowed face of the mysterious man, the weight of the doll dropping into my candy bag, the terror in my mother's eyes. These images remain vivid in my mind. But now, with the perspective that age brings, I also wonder about the nuances I might have missed as a child. Did the man who gave me the doll really have malicious intentions? Or was he just a lonely old man, trying to participate in Halloween in the only way he knew how? The coincidence with my mom's past story was chilling, no doubt, but could it have been just that? A coincidence? These questions haunt me. Constant reminders that not everything in the world is black and white, not even the scariest of dolls. The fear I felt that night, and in the days that followed, shaped much of who I became. I developed an interest in psychology, particularly in the study of fears and phobias. Part of me hopes that by understanding how fear works, I can finally unravel the mystery of that Halloween night. Another part knows that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Sometimes, when I pass by a toy store and see dolls on the shelves, I feel a familiar chill run down my spine. Halloween, though I still celebrate it, has never again had the same sense of adventure and excitement as it did in my childhood. But I've learned to live with that change, to accept that some experiences mark us in ways we can never fully predict or understand. The white doll, whether it was a symbol of real danger or just a catalyst for deeper fears, has become an integral part of my personal story, a constant reminder that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that never have a clear ending. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the empty house, making my heart skip a beat. I wasn't expecting visitors this early. After all, it was only 6:30 p.m., and the sun had barely set. I placed a bowl of candy on the coffee table and headed for the door, adjusting the last-minute vampire costume I'd thrown together. My parents had gone to a Halloween party at a nearby club, leaving me in charge of handing out candy to the neighborhood kids. I didn't mind. At 17, I already considered myself too old for trick-or-treating, but I still appreciated the holiday spirit. Besides, spending Friday night at home alone sounded pretty appealing. I opened the door, expecting to see a group of costumed kids shouting trick or treat. Instead, I was met with an empty street, lit only by the glow of the street lights and the Halloween decorations on the neighboring houses. Weird, I thought, shrugging it off and closing the door. Probably some prankster ringing the bell and running off. I went back to the living room, turned on the TV, and flipped to a channel playing classic horror movies. The night was surprisingly quiet for Halloween. Maybe families had opted for indoor parties due to the chilly weather outside. As I watched the movie, I occasionally glanced at the front window, expecting to see some activity. But the street remained eerily still, with no sign of the usual hordes of costumed kids. The silence started to make me uneasy. It felt as if the entire neighborhood had skipped Halloween this year, which seemed absurd. I tried to focus on the movie, but my mind kept wandering where everyone was. The absence of the usual laughter and shouts of children going house to house made the night feel strangely unsettling. About an hour passed, and the doorbell hadn't rung again. I was starting to consider turning off the porch lights and packing up the candy when I heard a noise from outside. It wasn't the doorbell, though it sounded muffled like someone walking on the grass. My first instinct was relief. Finally, someone had come for candy. But then I realized I didn't hear any voices or laughter, just slow, heavy footsteps. A knot of unease formed in my stomach. I got up from the couch, hesitant, and walked toward the front window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a shadow moving on the other side, illuminated by the porch light. It was a tall figure, much larger than any kid. My throat went dry. Something about that silhouette felt off. I couldn't explain exactly why, but my instincts were screaming that this wasn't a typical trick-or-treater. Then, the doorbell rang again, making me jump. The sound echoed through the quiet house, louder and more menacing than before. My heart raced as I stood frozen for a moment before moving toward the door. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the doorknob. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It's just a late trick-or-treater, I told myself, though a voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was wrong. I slowly turned the doorknob and opened the door, forcing a smile that quickly faded. Standing before me was the most disturbing figure I had ever seen. A man tall, extremely tall, dressed in a clown costume that looked like it had stepped straight out of a nightmare. His face was hidden behind a white mask with a grotesque, exaggerated red smile painted on. The eyes, concealed behind black holes in the mask, stared at me with an unsettling intensity. His costume, a chaotic mix of bright colors and clashing patterns, was tattered and stained in places, giving him a ragged, threatening look. I stood frozen, unable to react or speak. The clown remained motionless, his gaze fixed on me, silent. Finally, I found my voice, though it came out shaky and weak. Can I help you?" I asked, trying to stay calm. The clown tilted his head slightly, a movement that somehow felt even more disturbing than his previous stillness. Then, in a deep, raspy voice that didn't match his appearance, he spoke. "Trick or treat? The words came out as a threatening whisper, sending chills down my spine. I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. Something told me this wasn't an ordinary Halloween visitor. Instinctively, I stepped back, putting more distance between us. "Sorry," I stammered, "but we're out of candy." It was an obvious lie, considering the full bowl behind me, but at that moment, I just wanted him to leave. The clown didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on me, as if he could see right through my lie. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. A bead of sweat rolled down my forehead. Finally, unable to take the tension any longer, I muttered a quick goodnight and shut the door, locking it immediately. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, I stood there, waiting to hear footsteps retreating. But the silence on the other side of the door was absolute. Minutes passed, and I remained pressed against the door, trying to calm my ragged breathing. The silence outside felt oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the clown was still there, standing, waiting. Slowly, I gathered the courage to look through the peephole. My heart nearly stopped when I saw that he was still there, as still as a statue, his black eyes fixed on the door as if he could see me through it. I recoiled, a wave of panic flooding me. I tried to convince myself it was just an elaborate Halloween prank, that he'd get bored and leave soon. But as the minutes dragged on, that hope began to fade. I turned off all the lights as I made my way back to the living room, hoping the darkness would discourage him. I sat on the couch, my eyes glued to the front door, listening for any sound. The only noises were the ticking of the clock on the wall and my own shallow breathing. Then suddenly the doorbell rang again, making me jump. The sound echoed through the house, louder and more insistent than before. I froze, unable to move. The bell rang again, and then again, in rapid, frantic succession. My heart pounded so loudly, I feared it could be heard outside. The ringing grew more urgent, almost aggressive, as if the finger pressing it was determined not to stop until I answered. Slowly, I stood, my legs shaking. I approached the door with hesitant steps, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I looked through the peephole again, expecting to see the clown pressing the doorbell. But what I saw terrified me even more. He was standing perfectly still, exactly as he had been before, arms at his sides, not touching the bell at all. Yet, the bell continued to ring incessantly. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed my parents' number. I needed help, someone to tell me what to do, but the line was busy. I tried again, and again. Nothing. The doorbell kept up its frantic chime, like some sinister soundtrack to my growing panic. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The creaking of the outer door being forced open. The clown was trying to get in. The sound of the wood cracking under pressure snapped me out of my daze. I ran to the kitchen, my mind racing with panic. I needed to arm myself with something, anything. Grabbing the first thing I saw, a heavy cast iron skillet, I rushed back to the living room, holding it up defensively. The noise at the front door grew louder, more insistent. I could hear the wood splintering, the lock groaning under the strain. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. When I reached the living room, I saw the front door was already partially open, the lock hanging uselessly. Through the gap, I could see the clown, his white mask standing out eerily against the darkness. He was pushing the door with surprising strength, the wood groaning in protest. I knew it was only a matter of time before he got in. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline, I ran up the stairs, my mind screaming at me to hide, to lock myself somewhere safe. I took the steps two at a time, nearly tripping in my haste. Behind me, I heard the crash as the outer door finally gave way. The clown was inside the house. I darted into the first room I saw, my parents' bedroom, and locked the door, shoving a heavy dresser against it for extra security. Panting and trembling, I backed away from the door, my eyes glued to it, waiting for it to burst open at any moment. The silence that followed was almost as frightening as the noise before. There were no footsteps, no sounds of movement. It was as if the intruder had vanished, but I knew he was still there, somewhere waiting. I forced myself to think clearly, despite the panic threatening to overwhelm me. I needed help. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone again. This time, I didn't try my parents. I dialed 911. As I waited for the call to connect, my eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement in the shadows. Then I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The window was open, and the curtains were swaying gently in the night breeze. I froze, staring at the open window. I was sure I had closed all the windows earlier. The 911 operator's voice sounded distant in my ear, asking for details of the emergency. With a shaky voice, I began explaining the situation, my eyes never leaving the window. That's when I saw it, a subtle movement in the shadows outside. My heart stopped for a second, slowly, like a nightmare in slow motion. The clown appeared outside the window. He was standing on a ladder, his masked face level with the windowsill. The black holes where his eyes should have been seemed to bore into my soul, his painted smile more sinister than ever in the moonlight. I let out a scream and dropped the phone. The 911 operator's voice was still faintly audible from the fallen phone. The clown didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, staring at me, his gaze unblinking, as if watching my every move. For a few horrifying moments, I was frozen in place, unable to move or tear my eyes away. Time seemed to slow down, the only sounds my labored breathing and the frantic beating of my heart. Then, slowly and deliberately, the clown raised a hand and placed it on the windowsill. That small gesture snapped me out of my trance. In a surge of panic, I lunged for the phone. "Please," I shouted to the operator. "He's here. He's at the windows." My voice was shaky with terror. The operator responded urgently, assuring me that the police were on their way. But with the clown slowly climbing through the window, those words offered little comfort. With my heart in my throat, I did the only thing I could. I ran. I shoved the dresser away from the door and squeezed through the gap as quickly as I could. I didn't look back to see if the clown had made it all the way inside. The sound of heavy footsteps behind me was all the incentive I needed to keep running. I raced down the stairs in a blur, nearly tripping over the last few steps. My mind was in full-blown panic, incapable of forming any coherent thoughts other than run and hide. The sound of footsteps behind me echoed through the house, getting closer with every second. I bolted into the kitchen, frantically searching for an escape. The back door, with trembling hands, I fumbled with the lock, cursing under my breath as I struggled to turn it. Finally, the door swung open. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it was a welcome relief compared to the suffocating terror inside the house. I ran through the backyard, the wet grass slippery under my feet. I reached the back fence and scrambled over it without hesitation, ignoring the splinters that scratched my hands and legs. I landed heavily on the other side in the neighbor's yard. I quickly got back to my feet, glancing back. There was no sign of the clown following me, but that didn't lessen my panic. I kept running, cutting through yards and jumping fences, my only thought to put as much distance between me and that terrifying figure as possible. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself back on the main street of the neighborhood, panting and trembling. That's when I heard the sirens. The sound grew louder with each second, and soon I saw the flashing lights of several police cars approaching. I waved frantically, shouting for help. The cars screeched to a stop near me, and several officers jumped out, guns drawn. Between sobs and gasps for breath, I tried to explain what had happened. The officers calmed me down, assuring me they'd take care of the situation. While a few officers escorted me to a patrol car to ask me more questions, others headed toward my house, moving cautiously. I sat in the back of the police car, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, watching the scene unfold. The minutes dragged by as I waited, my heart still racing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers returned. His expression was a mix of confusion and concern as he began to ask me questions about what I had seen. The officer sat beside me in the car, notebook in hand. "So, tell me exactly what happened," he said, his tone gentle but firm. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my chaotic thoughts. I started from the beginning, describing the arrival of the clown, his terrifying appearance, and the attempt to break into the house. My voice shook as I spoke, the memories still fresh and terrifying. The officer listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished my story, the officer was silent for a moment, his face thoughtful. "I understand you were scared," he began, "but we need to verify a few things." He informed me that his colleagues had conducted a thorough search of the house and the surrounding area. They hadn't found any signs of forced entry, no footprints in the yard, or ladder marks on the side of the house. My heart sank. I knew what he was thinking, that I might have imagined everything. But the front door was broken, I argued, my voice rising. And the bedroom window was open. The officer nodded patiently. "The front door appears to have been damaged by recent strong winds," he explained. "And as for the window, well, sometimes we forget to close things." A wave of frustration and fear washed over me. They didn't believe me. How could they not see the danger? At that moment, another officer approached the car. He exchanged a few quiet words with his colleague, then turned to me. "We found something interesting," he said. My heart leapt. Finally, some proof. But what he said next left me even more confused. "There's a ladder propped up against the side of your house. Is it your father's?" I shook my head, unsure. The officer continued, "It looks like someone used it recently. There are muddy footprints on the steps." A chill ran down my spine. The ladder was real. The clown had used it to get to the bedroom window. But if the ladder was there, why hadn't they found any other evidence? Questions swirled in my mind, mixing with fear and confusion. The officers exchanged glances, clearly trying to piece together the situation. I could see on their faces that they weren't sure what to think. Were they dealing with a real crime or the overactive imagination of a scared teenager? The rest of the night passed in a blur of questions, statements, and phone calls. My parents were contacted and were on their way home, having left the party in a hurry as soon as they heard what had happened. The police continued their investigation, combing through the neighborhood for any sign of the mysterious clown. I remained in the patrol car, exhausted and still trembling occasionally, replaying the night's events in my mind. When my parents finally arrived, it was like a dam had broken. All the emotions I'd been holding in came flooding out, and I found myself sobbing into my mother's arms while my father spoke in worried tones with the officers. They listened to my story, their faces a mixture of concern and confusion. I could see that they wanted to believe me, but the lack of evidence made everything complicated. After what felt like an eternity of discussions and deliberations, a decision was made. It wasn't safe to stay at home tonight, not with so many unanswered questions. My best friend, Jake, lived a few blocks away. His parents were contacted and agreed to let me stay with them for the rest of the night. The idea of not having to stay alone was a huge relief, but the thought of leaving my home and my parents made me anxious. As I prepared to leave, I couldn't help but glance nervously at the shadows around us. Could the clown still be lurking somewhere, watching, waiting? The police assured us they would keep a patrol car stationed on the street overnight, but that did little to calm my nerves. I hugged my parents tightly, promising to call as soon as I got to Jake's house. As I climbed into the patrol car that would take me there, I couldn't shake the feeling that this Halloween night had changed my life forever. The ride to Jake's house was short, but every shadow on the street, every sudden noise, made me jump. When we finally arrived, the sight of Jake's well-lit, welcoming home was like a beacon of safety. His parents greeted me at the door, their faces a mix of concern and sympathy. Jake, still groggy with sleep, looked confused but ready to offer comfort. As I settled into the guest room, exhausted but still on edge, I couldn't help but wonder, had this all been just a Halloween prank gone too far, or was there something more sinister at play? The cold October air cut through my skin as I stared at the abandoned house at the end of the street, its shattered windows staring back at us like hollow eyes. It was the eve of Halloween, and our group of friends, driven by a mix of teenage boredom and bravado, had decided that tonight was perfect for an adventure. The idea came up during lunch at school, between bites of sandwiches and nervous laughter. Tommy, always the most daring among us, suggested we explore the old Carlson mansion, abandoned for years and the source of countless urban legends in our small town. As we approached the property, a shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The tall grass and overgrown weeds seemed to swallow the driveway, as if nature was trying to reclaim what once belonged to civilization. Shadows danced on the peeling walls, cast by the faint moonlight that occasionally peeked through the clouds. The creak of the rusty gate echoed through the silent night as Tommy pushed it open, making us all freeze for a moment. Kevin, usually the quietest and most cautious of our group, looked particularly nervous. His eyes darted around as if he expected a monster to leap from the shadows at any moment. I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he stuffed them into his jacket pockets. Part of me wanted to suggest we turn back, that this whole idea was insane, but the look of excitement in the other's eyes stopped me. We were young, invincible, and danger was just an abstract concept in our immature minds. As we neared the front porch, the wooden steps groaned under our weight, as if the house itself was protesting our intrusion. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and decay, a tangible reminder of years of neglect. Tommy pulled a flashlight from his pocket, its beam dancing across the boarded-up windows and peeling paint. That was when the atmosphere changed, and the reality of our situation began to sink in. "So, who's going first?" Tommy asked, his voice betraying a slight tremor he was desperately trying to hide. We looked at each other, each of us hoping someone else would volunteer. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant howl of the wind and the occasional creak of old wood adjusting. It was in that moment of collective hesitation that Kevin, to everyone's surprise, stepped forward. His eyes, once filled with fear, now shone with a determination I had never seen before. Little did I know that this simple act of courage would change our lives forever. The silence following Kevin's decision was broken by Tommy, who quickly turned the situation into a formal challenge. "All right, Kevin, since you're the brave one, how about a bet?" Tommy said with a sly grin. "If you go in alone and bring something back as proof, we'll all give you half of our Halloween candy." The other boys murmured in agreement, clearly relieved that they weren't the ones going into the eerie house. Kevin hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking from the front door to us and back. I could see the conflict on his face, fear warring with the desire to prove himself. "What if I don't want to go in?" Kevin asked, his voice trembling slightly. Tommy laughed, a cruel sound that echoed in the silent night. "Then you'll be the chicken forever." Imagine, little baby Kevin too scared of an old house. The others laughed nervously, and I saw Kevin's face flush with embarrassment. I wanted to step in to say we didn't have to do this, but the words stuck in my throat. It was as if we were all caught in an invisible script, unable to veer off the path we'd chosen. Kevin took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and said, "All right, I'll do it." His voice was firm now, a surprising resolve in his eyes. Tommy grinned, clearly pleased with himself, and handed Kevin his flashlight. "Remember, you need to bring something back from inside as proof. And nothing from near the entrance. You have to go deeper into the house." Kevin nodded, taking the flashlight with only a slight tremble in his hands. He turned toward the door, the old wood groaning under his feet as he stepped onto the porch. With one last look back at us, Kevin turned the rusty doorknob. The door creaked open with a spine-chilling groan, revealing a dark and dusty hallway. The flashlight beams swept over the peeling wallpaper and covered furniture, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. For a moment, Kevin froze, as if all his courage had evaporated in the face of the reality of what he was about to do. But then, in a swift motion that seemed more like a way to overcome his own fear than genuine bravery, he stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a dull thud, and suddenly the silence felt deafening. We stood there, staring at the dark facade of the house, waiting. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Occasionally, we could see the faint glow of the flashlight through the dirty windows, moving from room to room. But other than that, there was no sign of Kevin. The tension in the air was palpable, growing with every passing moment that our friend didn't reappear. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as we waited outside the abandoned house. What had begun as a night of youthful excitement and bravado quickly turned into a growing sense of anxiety. Each minute that Kevin remained inside weighed on us like a dark cloud. Tommy, who had once shown nothing but arrogant confidence, now alternated between pacing nervously and staring fixedly at the front door. The other boys whispered to each other, their voices tinged with concern. I found myself counting the seconds, trying to convince myself that not too much time had passed. "How long has he been in there?" Mike asked, his voice quivering slightly. I checked my watch and felt my stomach drop. "Almost 20 minutes, I replied, hardly believing it myself. 20 minutes. It felt like an eternity. The oppressive silence coming from the house was overwhelming. There were no sounds of footsteps, no noise of exploration. Just a deadly quiet that seemed to swallow any hope that Kevin was all right. The worry began to shift into panic, and I could see in my friend's eyes that we were all thinking the same thing. What if something had happened to him? Tommy was the first to voice what we were all thinking. Maybe we should go in and look for him, he suggested, his earlier bravado completely gone. There was a nervous murmur of agreement from the group. The idea of going into that dark, silent house was terrifying, but the thought of leaving Kevin behind was even worse. We were just about to move toward the door when a sound froze us in our tracks. It was the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. We all turned at the same time, our breath caught in our throats. The door opened slowly, as if whoever was behind it barely had the strength to push it. And then, finally, Kevin emerged from the darkness. But it wasn't the same Kevin who had entered the house 20 minutes earlier. This Kevin looked like he had aged years in mere minutes. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were different. Empty, distant, as if they had seen something too terrible to comprehend. He walked down the steps of the porch mechanically, as though his body was moving on autopilot. I noticed that his hands were empty. He hadn't brought anything out as proof. But none of us cared about that at the moment. We were all too shocked by the transformation in our friend. When Kevin finally reached us, I could see silent tears streaming down his face. I tried to speak, to ask what had happened, but the words stuck in my throat. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Kevin's muffled sobs and the wind howling through the trees, as if the night itself was mourning whatever had occurred inside that cursed house. The days that followed our ill-fated adventure were filled with an unbearable tension. Kevin, once a lively and social kid, became a shadow of his former self. At school, he drifted through the hallways like a ghost, his eyes always staring at something far away, as if he was constantly reliving whatever had happened that night. We tried talking to him, tried to figure out what he had seen or experienced inside the house, but he refused to say a word about it. Each time we brought up the house or that night, he would visibly flinch, as if the very words were painful to hear. Kevin's behavior didn't go unnoticed by the teachers and other students. Rumors started to spread, exaggerated stories of what might have happened inside the abandoned house. Some said Kevin had seen a ghost, others that he had stumbled upon evidence of a horrific crime. But the truth, whatever it was, remained locked inside Kevin's tormented mind. His parents, worried by their son's sudden and drastic change, started taking him to a therapist, but even that didn't seem to help. Kevin refused to talk during the sessions, maintaining a stubborn silence that frustrated both the therapist and his parents. Our once solid friendship began to unravel. Kevin withdrew further and further, refusing invitations to hang out or participate in the activities he used to love. Tommy, consumed by guilt for having pressured Kevin into going inside, tried multiple times to apologize, but Kevin simply ignored him, as though Tommy didn't even exist. The rest of us were left in a painful limbo, torn between loyalty to Kevin and the inability to help him. We watched helplessly as our friend spiraled deeper into his own dark, isolated world. Weeks turned into months, and Kevin's transformation seemed permanent. He rarely smiled or laughed, and when he did, it was a hollow, forced sound, more like a parody of joy than the real thing. His eyes, once filled with life and curiosity, now seemed like windows into a bottomless pit of fear and despair. On the rare occasions when we managed to get him to talk, His voice was low and monotone, as if each word required immense effort. It was as though a vital part of Kevin had been left behind in that abandoned house, leaving only an empty shell of the boy we once knew. As time passed, any hope that Kevin might one day return to his old self began to fade. His parents, desperate for answers and a cure for whatever was afflicting their son, started to consider more drastic options. I heard rumors that they were thinking of sending Kevin to a special school or even some kind of institution. The thought of losing our friend forever hung over us like a dark cloud, a constant reminder of the consequences of our actions that night. Meanwhile, the abandoned house still stood, silent and imposing at the end of the street, holding its secrets and Kevin's fate within its decaying walls. The inevitable finally happened on a cold March morning, nearly 5 months after our ill-fated adventure. I arrived at school to find an unusual buzz in the air. Groups of students huddled together in the hallways, whispering and casting glances in my direction. My heart sank as Mike came running up to me, his face a mix of shock and sadness. "Kevin's gone," he said breathlessly. His family moved out overnight. No one knew they were planning it. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. Even with Kevin's growing distance over the past months, the idea that he had left without even saying goodbye was too painful to process. In the days that followed, we tried desperately to find out where Kevin had gone. Neighbors said his family had mentioned something vague about a fresh start in another town, but no one knew exactly where they had moved. Their house sat empty, a large for sale sign on the lawn serving as a cruel reminder of our friend's absence. We tried calling Kevin's cell phone, but the number had been disconnected. It was as if he had simply vanished, taking all traces of his life in our small town with him. Kevin's abrupt departure left a void in our lives that none of us knew how to fill. Our friendship, already strained by the events of the past few months, seemed to crumble completely. Tommy, racked with guilt, became reclusive and barely spoke to any of us. The other boys in the group gradually drifted away, as if Kevin's absence had exposed the cracks in our relationships that had been there all along, just waiting to split open. I found myself lost, constantly replaying that fateful night in my mind, wondering if there was something we could have done differently, some way to have avoided the terrible fate that had swallowed our friend. As the years went by, the memory of Kevin and that night in the abandoned house began to fade, turning into more of a cautionary tale than a vivid recollection. Occasionally, I'd hear rumors about Kevin, a distant cousin who saw him in another town, or a former neighbor who heard he was having trouble. But nothing concrete, nothing that gave me a real sense of what had become of him. Meanwhile, the abandoned house still stood, a silent monument to our youthful mistake. Sometimes, when I walked by, I could swear I saw a pale face peering out from one of the broken windows, but every time I looked again, there was nothing there but shadows and shattered glass. It wasn't until many years later, when I was an adult with a family of my own, that I finally discovered Kevin's fate. An obituary in a newspaper from a distant city caught my attention. Kevin had passed away, the victim of an overdose after years of struggling with addiction. The obituary mentioned a life marked by mental health challenges and substance abuse, a battle he had finally lost at the age of 30. As I read the cold, impersonal words summarizing Kevin's turbulent life, I couldn't help but think of the laughing boy I'd known in childhood and the haunted young man who had emerged from that abandoned house. Whatever Kevin had seen or experienced that night, it was clear he had never fully recovered. And as I set the newspaper aside, a tear slipping down my face, I couldn't stop wondering, what exactly had happened in that house that was capable of destroying a life so completely and irrevocably? The news of Kevin's death hit me like a tsunami, dragging me back to that fateful Halloween night so many years ago. In the days that followed, I found myself spiraling into a cycle of guilt and regret. I couldn't stop thinking about how we could have changed the course of events if we'd been more sensible, more courageous in standing up to peer pressure. Memories of Kevin, his easy smile before that night, the haunted look in his eyes after, haunted me endlessly. I decided that I had to do something, anything, to try and understand what had really happened, and maybe find some form of redemption. Driven by an almost obsessive need for answers, I began researching the old Carlson mansion. I spent hours in the local library, sifting through dusty archives and old newspaper microfilms. I discovered that the house had a dark history long before our youthful adventure. Built in the early 20th century by a wealthy industrialist, the mansion had been the site of a series of tragedies over the years. The first owner died under mysterious circumstances, and his family quickly moved out, claiming the house was sick. In the following years, the property passed through several hands, each new owner seemingly cursed with misfortune, premature deaths, inexplicable accidents, bouts of madness. The more I learned about the house's history, the more disturbed I became. The similarities between the accounts of former residents and Kevin's behavior after that night were eerie. Many spoke of a malevolent presence, an oppressive feeling of dread that seemed to permeate the very walls of the mansion. Some described terrifying visions, experiences that defied logic and sanity. One former resident, in a particularly chilling account, spoke of shadows that moved on their own and whispers that came from nowhere. Was that what Kevin had experienced? Had he seen or felt something so deeply unsettling that it permanently altered his perception of reality? My search for answers led me beyond the bounds of conventional research. I began connecting with online groups dedicated to the paranormal and the occult. I shared the story of the Carlson house and Kevin, hoping someone might shed light on what could have happened. The responses I received ranged from skeptical to bizarre. Some suggested psychological explanations, that fear and suggestion could have caused an intense hallucinatory experience for Kevin. Others spoke of dimensional portals, demonic entities, or psychic echoes of past tragedies. While many of these theories seemed far-fetched, I couldn't dismiss them entirely. After all, whatever Kevin had experienced was clearly beyond the ordinary. As my obsession grew, I realized there was only one way to truly understand what Kevin had gone through. I had to go back to the Carlson house. The thought terrified me, but I also felt that I owed it to Kevin a final chance to understand and perhaps make peace with the past. I planned my visit meticulously, choosing a night of the new moon to ensure maximum darkness. Armed with a powerful flashlight, a camera, and an audio recorder, I prepared myself to face the horrors that had destroyed my friend. As I approached the old mansion, now even more dilapidated with time, I felt the familiar chill crawl up my spine. The house seemed to watch me, its broken windows like empty eyes staring into the night. With my heart pounding and hands trembling, I pushed open the front door, ready to uncover the dark secrets the Carlson mansion had kept hidden for so long. The creak of the door echoed through the empty house, sending shivers down my spine. The air inside was heavy, filled with the smell of mold and decay. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing layers of dust and cobwebs. Every step I took made the floorboards groan, as if the house itself was protesting my intrusion. I began exploring methodically, room by room, trying to imagine the path Kevin had taken so many years ago. The living room, once grand, was now a graveyard of broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. In the center, a large cracked mirror reflected my distorted image, making me jump. As I ventured deeper into the house, a growing sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't just the gloomy atmosphere or the state of abandonment. There was something more, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It felt as if the air was getting heavier, more oppressive with each step. Occasionally, I heard strange sounds, creaks and groans that couldn't be explained by the old structure alone. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a whisper from a dark corner, but when I pointed my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing but shadows. My heart raced as I fought the urge to flee. On the second floor, the atmosphere grew even more suffocating. I entered what appeared to have been a child's bedroom. Broken, dust-covered toys were scattered across the floor, creating a scene that was disturbingly eerie. It was in this room that something truly inexplicable happened. My camera, which had been functioning perfectly up until then, started to glitch. The screen flickered and distorted, showing images that didn't make sense, disfigured faces, shadows moving in unnatural ways. At the same time, I felt a sudden drop in temperature, the air around me turning icy cold. A sense of dread washed over me, an irrational certainty that I wasn't alone in that room. Fighting the rising panic, I forced myself to continue the exploration. Each new room seemed to bring a fresh wave of terror. In the attic, I found strange symbols drawn on the floor, partially obscured by years of dust. In the basement, the darkness felt alive, shifting and pulsing in ways that defied logic. My audio recorder picked up sounds I couldn't hear, whispers, moans, and at one particularly chilling moment, what sounded like a child crying. As I moved forward, the sensation of being watched, of being surrounded by something evil and unseen, became almost unbearable. It was in the last room at the end of a long, dark hallway that I had the experience that would change my life forever. As soon as I stepped inside, all my equipment failed simultaneously. The flashlight flickered and died, the camera shut off, the audio recorder emitted a high-pitched squeal before going silent. I was plunged into the deepest darkness I'd ever known. And then, in the silence and the blackness, I saw it. I can't adequately describe what I witnessed in that room. It was shapes and movements that defied human comprehension, visions that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. For what felt like an eternity, I was exposed to horrors my mind struggled to process. When I finally managed to move, I ran blindly through the house, tripping and falling, desperate to escape. Only when I burst into the fresh night air, panting and trembling uncontrollably, did I realize I had been screaming the entire time. The days that followed my experience at the Carlson house were a blur of nightmares and anxiety. I couldn't sleep without being tormented by visions of what I had seen in that room. During the day, I constantly felt like something was watching me, following me. I tried reviewing the recordings and photos I'd taken during my exploration, but most were corrupted or distorted beyond recognition. The few images I managed to recover were too disturbing to look at for long. Shadows that seemed to take on impossible shapes, reflections in mirrors that didn't show my face, but something else. Desperate for answers, I sought the help of paranormal experts, local historians, even a priest. I shared my story, showing them the evidence I had collected. The reactions ranged from fascination to horror, but no one could offer a satisfying explanation for what I had experienced. The priest, after hearing my account, made the sign of the cross and advised me never to return to that place. A parapsychologist suggested that the house might be a reality break zone, a place where the normal laws of the universe didn't fully apply. But no theory or explanation could quell the terror that had become a constant part of my life. As the weeks turned into months, I began to understand what Kevin must have gone through. The feeling of being disconnected from reality, of carrying a secret so heavy and incomprehensible that it couldn't be shared. I started withdrawing from friends and family, unable to explain what was happening to me. My work suffered, my relationships deteriorated. In moments of weakness, I found myself turning to alcohol and medication to try to drown out the memories and visions that haunted me. It was as if a part of me had been left behind in that house, just like Kevin so many years ago. But amid the despair, a resolution began to form in my mind. I couldn't let what happened to Kevin happen to me. I couldn't allow that house, that entity, or whatever it was to destroy another life. With a determination born out of fear and anger, I started planning. I researched cleansing rituals, methods for destroying haunted places, anything that might offer a chance to rid the world of the evil that resided in the Carlson house. I knew it was dangerous, that I was risking not just my sanity, but possibly my life. But I felt I owed it to Kevin, to myself, and to anyone else who might one day cross paths with that cursed place. On a night of the full moon, I returned to the Carlson house for the last time. Armed with salt, holy water, and an ironclad resolve, I entered the mansion, ready to face its horrors. What happened that night? The battles I fought against forces beyond human comprehension, the visions I witnessed, and the sacrifices I made will forever be etched in my memory. When the sun rose the next morning, the Carlson house was nothing more than smoldering ashes. As I watched the last remnants of that sinister place disappear, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. I don't know if I succeeded in fully destroying the evil that resided there, or if I merely dispersed it, but I know that I did what I could to prevent any more lives from being destroyed like Kevin's was. And as I walked away from the ruins, carrying with me the invisible scars of my experience, I felt, for the first time in years, a sense of peace. Kevin could finally rest, and I could begin to live again. The Halloween night of 1977 in Oakville, Nebraska, began like so many others for the Reynolds family. The air was filled with the typical excitement of the holiday, with children in costumes roaming the streets in search of candy, as dry leaves danced to the tune of the autumn wind. Thomas and Sarah Reynolds had spent the afternoon decorating their house with smiling pumpkins and fake spider webs, creating the perfect setting to welcome the evening's little visitors. However, for their daughter, Lily Rose, an adorable 19-month-old girl, it was just another ordinary night. As dusk gave way to darkness, the Reynolds prepared to put Lily to bed. Sarah gently rocked the little one, humming a lullaby while cradling her in her arms. Lily's sleepy eyes struggled to stay open, blinking slowly as she snuggled against her mother's chest. Thomas watched the scene from the bedroom doorway, a tender smile on his face, amazed by the simple beauty of that family moment. Finally, when Lily succumbed to sleep, Sarah carefully laid her in her crib, adjusting the blanket around her and placing a soft kiss on her forehead. The Reynolds spent the rest of the evening handing out candy to the costumed children who knocked on their door, laughing and complimenting the creative outfits. Every now and then, one of them would pause to check on Lily, always finding her peacefully asleep in her crib. As the night wore on and the flow of visitors slowed, Thomas and Sarah began preparing for bed. They checked on Lily one last time, adjusting her blanket once more and turning on the baby monitor before retreating to their own room. That night, as they lay down to sleep, Thomas and Sarah talked about plans for the future, dreams they had for Lily and their family. They discussed the possibility of having another child, changes they wanted to make to the house, and trips they hoped to take. It was a conversation full of hope and optimism, the kind young parents have when they feel like they have the whole world ahead of them. Little did they know that their lives were about to change irrevocably, and that this seemingly ordinary Halloween night would mark the beginning of a nightmare from which they would never fully awaken. When they finally fell asleep, the silence of the night enveloped the Reynolds home. The wind outside had calmed, the streets were empty, and the darkness seemed deeper than usual. In Lily's room, the soft glow of a night light cast dancing shadows on the walls as the little girl slept peacefully, oblivious to the cruel fate that awaited her. And so, in that deceptive stillness, the minutes dragged on, each second bringing the Reynolds family closer to a moment that would forever alter their lives. The dawn of November 1st brought an unusual quiet to the Reynolds house. Thomas was the first to wake, unsettled by the silence that hung in the air. By this time, Lily would normally be making noise, eager to start her day. With a growing sense of discomfort, he got up and walked to his daughter's room. The door was slightly ajar, just as they had left it the night before. Thomas pushed it open gently, expecting to see Lily standing in her crib, smiling at him as she did every morning. But the crib was empty. For a moment, Thomas froze, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. "Lily?" he called, his trembling voice breaking the oppressive silence. There was no response. Heart pounding, he began frantically searching the room, looking in every corner, under every piece of furniture, desperate to find some sign of his daughter. "Sarah!" he shouted, panic evident in his voice. "Sarah, wake up! Lily's gone!" Sarah rushed in, still in her pajamas, her face contorted with fear as she saw the terror in her husband's eyes. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity. Thomas and Sarah tore through the house, calling Lily's name, checking every room, every closet, every place a small child could hide. But with each passing moment, the terrible reality began to sink in. Lily was nowhere to be found. With trembling hands, Sarah dialed the police, her voice breaking with sobs as she reported her daughter missing. Meanwhile, Thomas ran out into the street, shouting Lily's name, pleading with sleepy neighbors for any information. The arrival of the police brought a new wave of activity to the Reynolds home. Detectives combed every inch of the property, looking for clues, any sign of a break-in or forced entry. But they found nothing. The doors were locked, the windows intact. There were no footprints in the yard, no signs of struggle in Lily's room. It was as if the little girl had simply vanished into thin air. The absence of physical evidence only deepened the mystery and horror of the situation. How could someone enter the house, take a child from her crib, and leave without leaving any trace? As the police continued their meticulous search, Thomas and Sarah sat in the living room, huddled together in shock. Neighbors began gathering outside, offering support and volunteering to help search. The news of Lily's disappearance spread quickly through the small Oakville community, bringing with it a wave of fear and disbelief. How could something so terrible happen here, in their quiet town? As the day wore on and Lily remained missing, a sense of dread began to settle in. What had started as a search for a lost girl was quickly turning into something far darker, and the Oakville community was about to be drawn into a nightmare from which it would not easily escape. The days following Lily Rose Reynolds' disappearance were a whirlwind of emotion and frantic activity. The small town of Oakville, Nebraska, rallied in an unprecedented way. Volunteers of all ages and backgrounds joined the search, scouring every inch of the town and its surroundings. Posters with Lily's smiling face were plastered everywhere, from streetlight poles to shop windows. The image of the golden-haired, bright-eyed girl became omnipresent, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had befallen the community. Thomas and Sarah Reynolds lived in a state of perpetual anguish. Their days were filled with police interviews, desperate pleas in the local media, and sleepless nights. Every phone call, every knock at the door brought with it a mix of hope and terror. Could this be the news they were longing for, or the definitive end of their dreams? The Reynolds home, once a warm place filled with the laughter of a child, now felt like a silent mausoleum, every room echoing with the painful absence of Lily. As the weeks passed with no concrete leads, the police investigation widened its scope. Detectives dug into the Reynolds past, interviewed neighbors and acquaintances, searching for any detail that might shed light on the mystery. Theories began to emerge. Was it a planned abduction? A random act of violence? Or something even more sinister? The lack of physical evidence continued to baffle investigators, fueling increasingly dark speculations. Tension in the community was palpable. Parents began keeping their children indoors, fearful that the abductor might strike again. The streets, once lively with children playing, became eerily quiet. The trust that had once existed among neighbors was replaced by suspicious glances and whispered fears. Oakville, once known for its tranquility and strong sense of community, now lived under a cloud of fear and mistrust. Amidst all this turmoil, Thomas and Sarah clung desperately to hope. They took turns sitting in Lily's room, rocking in the chair where they used to soothe her, imagining the moment they could hold her in their arms again. Sometimes, Sarah would find herself humming Lily's favorite lullabies, her voice choked with tears. Thomas spent hours staring at the phone, praying for a miracle that seemed increasingly out of reach. With each passing day, Lily's absence became more painful, more real, leaving a void that threatened to consume everything in its path. A month after Lily's disappearance, on a cold December afternoon, the phone at the Oakville police station rang. Detective Mark Holloway, who was leading the investigation, answered with the same mix of hope and apprehension that accompanied every new call related to the case. On the other end of the line, a trembling, frightened child's voice reported a gruesome discovery. Two children, playing in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, had found something terrible inside an old refrigerator. Holloway and his team rushed to the scene, their hearts heavy with the foreboding sense of what they might find. The abandoned house, a dilapidated structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, looked like something out of a nightmare. Upon entering, the stench of decay hit them like a wave. At the back of the kitchen, an old refrigerator lay like a metal coffin. With trembling hands and racing hearts, The officers opened the refrigerator door to reveal the small body of Lily Rose Reynolds. The scene was heartbreaking. Lily lay wrapped in a blanket, as if she were sleeping, her pale, serene face cruelly contrasting with the horror of the situation. The detectives, despite being accustomed to the harsh realities of their work, were deeply shaken. The silence that followed was broken only by muffled sobs as the team struggled to process the terrible discovery. The news spread through the town like wildfire, leaving a trail of grief and disbelief. For Thomas and Sarah Reynolds, it was as if their world had ended. The moment Detective Holloway knocked on their door, his somber face telling the story before the words were even spoken, would be forever etched in their memories. Sarah collapsed into Thomas's arms, her cries of anguish echoing through the house. Thomas, in contrast, remained silent, a vacant look in his eyes, as if a part of him had died along with his daughter. The Oakville community, already shaken by the disappearance, now found itself plunged into collective mourning. Candlelight vigils were held. People gathered in parks and churches, seeking comfort in one another. The innocence of the small town had been irreparably shattered. Parents hugged their children tighter. Doors were locked with extra care, and an air of suspicion lingered. Lily's murder wasn't just a tragedy for the Reynolds family. It was a blow to the very heart of the community. With the discovery of Lily's body, the investigation entered a new, more intense phase. Detective Holloway and his team worked tirelessly, determined to find whoever was responsible for such a heinous act. The autopsy revealed disturbing details about Lily's final moments, information that further devastated Thomas and Sarah. Many of these details were kept from the public, both to protect the integrity of the investigation and to spare the family and community additional pain. It was during this heightened phase of the investigation that a disturbing connection came to light. One of the detectives, combing through old cases in search of similar patterns, uncovered an incident that had occurred 2 years earlier in a neighboring town. In that case, twin girls, aged 3, had been found locked inside an abandoned refrigerator. One of the girls had survived, but the other had perished before they were found. The most alarming detail of that prior case was the prime suspect, a babysitter named Emily Sutton. Emily Sutton, coincidentally, had occasionally worked as a babysitter for the Reynolds family in the months leading up to Lily's disappearance. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Sutton, a woman in her 30s with a history of unstable jobs and erratic behavior, quickly became the prime focus of the investigation. Her alibi for the night of Lily's disappearance was shaky, and her history of undiagnosed mental health issues raised serious concerns. The police began meticulously digging into Emily Sutton's life. Interviews with former employers and acquaintances painted a picture of a complex and disturbed woman. Some described her as kind and caring with children, while others recounted episodes of unpredictable, sometimes frightening behavior. A pattern began to emerge. Emily seemed to have an almost obsessive fixation on babies and young children, often offering to care for strangers' children and showing an unusual interest in families with small kids. As the investigation deepened, Thomas Reynolds began recalling unsettling details from the months before Lily's disappearance. There was the strange incident when the family dog had mysteriously fallen ill, coinciding with one of Emily's visits. Small acts of vandalism around the property that had seemed random at the time now took on a more sinister significance. Thomas tortured himself with these memories, wondering how he hadn't seen the signs, how he had allowed this woman into his home, so close to his precious daughter. Despite the mounting suspicions against Emily Sutton, the police faced a crucial problem: a lack of concrete evidence. There were no witnesses placing her at the scene, no physical evidence directly linking her to Lily's abduction and murder. When questioned, Emily maintained a facade of bewildered innocence, vehemently denying any involvement in the case. Her frail appearance and tearful eyes during the interrogations starkly contrasted with the monster the investigators suspected she was. Frustration grew among the investigation team. They knew in their gut that Emily was guilty, but proving it in court was another matter. Detective Holloway spent sleepless nights poring over the evidence, desperately searching for the final piece of the puzzle that would conclusively incriminate Emily. The pressure from the community for answers and justice mounted daily, making the situation even more tense. Meanwhile, life in Oakville had changed irrevocably. Fear and mistrust permeated every aspect of daily life. Parents were reluctant to let their children out of sight, even for a moment. The children, once free to roam the streets, were now kept under constant supervision. The innocence and sense of security that had once characterized the small town had been shattered, replaced by an atmosphere of paranoia and collective mourning. For Thomas and Sarah Reynolds, each day was a battle to simply keep going. Lily's room remained untouched, a painful shrine to the daughter they had lost. Sarah spent hours sitting in the rocking chair, clutching Lily's favorite stuffed bear, her vacant eyes staring out the window. Thomas, consumed by his quest for justice, constantly pushed the police for updates, chasing down every small lead or rumor that surfaced. The pain of the Reynolds family was palpable, touching everyone in the community. Neighbors and friends took turns bringing meals, taking care of the house, and offering words of comfort, though they knew nothing could truly ease the couple's suffering. Lily's tragedy had become a burden shared by all of Oakville, a constant reminder of life's fragility and the cruelty that could exist even in the most unlikely places. As months passed, the investigation into the murder of Lily Rose Reynolds continued, but progress was painfully slow. Emily Sutton, though still the prime suspect, remained free due to the lack of conclusive evidence. The frustration in the Oakville community grew, with many questioning the effectiveness of the local police. Rumors and conspiracy theories began circulating, fueled by the absence of concrete answers. Thomas Reynolds, consumed by his quest for justice, began conducting his own parallel investigation. He spent hours scouring the internet, researching similar cases, and trying to connect the dots that the police might have missed. His obsession was slowly eroding his marriage to Sarah, who begged him to find a way to move on. The chasm between them grew wider with each passing day, filled with shared grief, but experienced in such different ways. Meanwhile, Emily Sutton continued her seemingly normal life in a neighboring town. She had secured a new job at a local daycare center, a fact that horrified the Oakville community when it came to light. The news sparked protests and urgent calls to authorities to take action. The idea that the supposed killer of Lily was free and working with children was unbearable for many. 1 year after Lily's disappearance, Oakville held a vigil in the little girl's memory. Hundreds of people gathered in the town's Central Park, holding candles and sharing memories of the child whose life had been brutally cut short. Thomas and Sarah were there, hand in hand, their faces marked by the pain and exhaustion of the past year. The event, though moving, also served as a painful reminder that the case remained unsolved. It was during this vigil that an unexpected event brought new hope to the investigation. An elderly woman, who had remained silent until then out of fear, approached Detective Holloway. With a trembling voice, she reported having seen Emily Sutton near the Reynolds house on the night of Lily's disappearance. This new testimony, while not definitive proof, was the first concrete evidence linking Emily to the crime scene. Armed with this new information, the police intensified their efforts to build a solid case against Emily Sutton. Detective Holloway and his team worked tirelessly, re-examining every detail of the case in light of this new testimony. They began pressing former acquaintances of Emily, digging deeper into her past and behavior. As the investigation gained new momentum, the lives of Thomas and Sarah Reynolds remained in a painful state of limbo. Lily's birthday came and went, a day that should have been filled with celebration, but was now just another cruel reminder of their loss. Sarah, unable to bear the constant pain and Thomas's obsession with the case, decided to temporarily move in with her sister in another state. The separation, though heartbreaking, seemed necessary for their emotional survival. The Oakville community, still deeply scarred by the tragedy, slowly began finding ways to move forward. A playground was built in Lily's honor, a bright and colorful place that starkly contrasted with the shadow that still hung over the town. Children gradually returned to the streets, though always under the watchful and anxious eyes of their parents. As the investigation approached its second year, a surprising turn of events occurred. Emily Sutton, under the renewed scrutiny and perhaps tormented by her own conscience, attempted to take her own life. She survived, but during her recovery in the hospital, she made a partial confession to a nurse. While she didn't directly admit to murdering Lily, her words strongly implicated her involvement. This confession, though not the definitive proof everyone had hoped for, was enough for the police to obtain a search warrant for Emily's residence. The search revealed disturbing evidence: photos of unknown children, including one of Lily, hidden in a secret album, and a diary filled with obsessive writings about babies and motherhood. These discoveries, combined with the earlier testimony and the partial confession, finally gave the police the evidence they needed to arrest Emily Sutton for the abduction and murder of Lily Rose Reynolds.